My stepfather abandoned me in the hospital for a vacation. I reached out to my dad, and CPS stepped in when my mother tried to force me to lie. My stepdad abandoned me in the hospital to go on vacation. I called my dad, and CPS got involved when my mom tried to make me lie. My stepfather disgusts me. He's one of the most annoying, controlling, and disrespectful people I've ever met. Since he married my mother, my life has been completely turned upside down. My parents divorced 3 years ago. They didn't get along and fought constantly. When they announced their divorce, I wasn't surprised. They had never been a perfect match from the start. They tried to make the marriage work, but there was constant conflict, mostly over household responsibilities. While my mother was legally a stay-at-home parent, she didn't enjoy the traditional chores that came with it. Cooking, cleaning, and even helping me with homework were never her priorities, and she made it clear she hated those tasks. Instead, she spent most of her time glued to her phone, trying to grow an online following. She fancied herself a beauty influencer, recording and posting videos despite having a modest following. When she wasn't on her phone, she spent large chunks of my dad's money on shopping trips, brunches, and beauty treatments. These were her regular activities. She never really fit the stereotypical mother role. While most parents check their children's schoolwork and ensure they're keeping up in school, my mom's primary focus was always herself. She was preoccupied with her appearance and wanted me to always look skinny and put together, as if I were a reflection of her image rather than an individual with my own needs. After the divorce, both of my parents were granted shared custody, so my time was divided between them. It took me a while to adjust to living in two different families. Just as I was becoming settled, my mom met him. She was infatuated from their first date. They began dating officially within days, and just a few weeks later, my mom insisted that I meet him. Suddenly, this stranger was everywhere, and I was expected to welcome him into our lives. If he had been a good person, I might not have had a problem with it, but he wasn't. From the start, he had unreasonable expectations. He assumed I would gladly accept him as my new father, despite the fact that he was a complete downgrade from my biological dad. He meddled in my life constantly and found every opportunity to mock me. No matter what I did, he found a way to criticize or control me. For example, he has 2 sons, Tyler and Hunter, and he gets visibly irritated whenever he thinks I'm acting too girly, as he puts it. He's even told me not to wear dresses or tight skirts, as if how I dress is any of his business. He insists I always wear my long hair in a bun and never let it down. It doesn't stop there. Whenever I have friends over, he interrupts, claiming he's just checking in. But it's never a brief hello or a casual query. He barges in and hovers around, acting like he doesn't trust me and my friends to be alone. It's intrusive and, frankly, humiliating. When I ask him to leave us alone, he dismisses it by saying things like, "Girls require constant supervision," and that we should just pretend I'm not here. It's frustrating that he doesn't feel the need to monitor his sons, Tyler and Hunter, in the same way. When I tried to express my concerns to my mother, hoping for support, she just brushed me off. She claimed he was just being protective, as if that justified his actions. On top of everything, his 2 sons, Tyler and Hunter, make my life even harder. They have no concept of personal space, and their personalities couldn't be more different from mine. They constantly bully me, teasing, mocking, and finding new ways to make me feel small. And instead of intervening, my mom dismisses their behavior, saying, "That's just how siblings bond." When my mom decided to marry him after only a year of dating, she expected me to fall in line. She made it clear that she loved him and was determined to make their marriage work. She knew I had reservations and frustrations, but she was clear about what she expected from me, to accept him without making things difficult for her. She begged me to welcome him as part of our family. It seemed like a lot to ask, especially since everything was happening so quickly, but I agreed to try, hoping to keep the peace. Since then, I've genuinely tried to accept him and his sons, Tyler and Hunter. I've tried to follow his routines and adapt to the changes, even though it hasn't been easy. What upsets me the most is his insistence that I call him Dad. It doesn't feel right, and every time I say it, I feel a rising tide of resentment. I already have a father, and I don't want to replace him. But he doesn't seem to care or understand how difficult this is for me. Beyond the name, what truly bothers me is how my mother's focus has shifted since her marriage. She seems more concerned with his sons, Tyler and Hunter, than with me. She spends more time with them, helping them in ways she never helped me, and treating them more like her children than she ever did for me. Sometimes it feels like I've lost my place in her life. She's simply a mother to his sons now. I'd want to live with my father, especially because he's normally more understanding. However, he had to relocate for a new job in another city, which paid him substantially more. He pays me occasional visits, but I live with my mother full-time. Dad and I also communicate on the phone frequently. He is aware of some of my concerns with him and his sons, Tyler and Hunter, since I have discussed them with him. He's really supportive and has even attempted to talk to my mother about the matter. I believe he sincerely wants to assist, but whenever he brings it up, my mother shuts him off. She tells him to back off and says he shouldn't meddle with her marriage. Despite everything, I've worked hard over the years to acclimate to life with my new family. I've really tried to make an effort with him and his sons, Tyler and Hunter, believing that if I remained patient and transparent, we could develop a nice relationship. Despite my best attempts, I continue to feel invisible within my own family. This year, he was suddenly promoted at work. When he got home, he excitedly declared that he'd be taking us all on a family trip. We were all excited by the news, especially since we hadn't been on a vacation together in a long time. He and Mom chose the location and reserved tickets and lodgings for all of us. Unfortunately, just a day before our trip, I was involved in a car accident with my mother. We were heading home from shopping for some clothing for our impending vacation when another automobile smashed into us from behind. It wasn't a major collision, but it was enough to throw us off course and cause some injuries. My mother was generally fine, with a few scrapes and bruises here and there, but I wasn't that fortunate. The accident caused me to break my arm and suffer a concussion. The ambulance arrived and I was quickly brought to the hospital. When he initially learned of our accident, he rushed to the hospital, appearing concerned at first. I assumed he was really concerned for my and my mother's well-being and that he had come to see us, but then he kept bringing up the trip, agonizing about whether we'd still be able to travel and worried that the money he'd invested would be wasted. The physicians eventually advised us that due to my concussion, I would need to spend a few days in the hospital for observation. They wanted to make sure I was okay before allowing me to return home, but travel was obviously out of the question for me. He glanced at me, irritated, as if I was to blame for getting into the accident and wasting his money. My mother half-heartedly offered to remain with me while I was in the hospital. It gave me hope that she would choose to help me during such a tough moment. He, on the other hand, was quick to respond, stating that because our plane tickets had already been purchased, we were already losing money by not going. He argued that my mother should not waste even more money by staying behind. He then turned to me and said that at my age, I should be able to stay in the hospital alone for a few days. He mentioned how safe the hospital was, with physicians and nurses available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, hinting that I had nothing to worry about. He then insisted that once I was discharged, he would arrange for a babysitter to stay with me at home. I argued with him that I didn't want to be alone in the hospital or have a babysitter look after me at home. I urged my mother to stay with me instead. At first, my mother tried to defend me, telling him that it wasn't proper to leave me alone in the hospital. She knew it was wrong. He, however, continued to push back. He insisted that my mother's presence was unneeded, and that her staying would mean sitting by my side, doing nothing meaningful all day. He made it appear as if her presence was pointless, entirely neglecting the emotional support she could truly offer. He prioritized avoiding spending his vacation money over anything else. It was evident that he didn't consider me to be his biological child. Thus, he didn't care how I felt or what had happened to me. I pleaded that at 15 years old, I shouldn't be left alone in the hospital. I was terrified and in agony, and the prospect of going through this without any family members around was overwhelming. I proposed a solution, stating that Mom could contact my father to come and stay with me while she and he went on their trip. Sure, it would take him some time to get here because he lived in another city, but I was confident he'd come right away if he realized I was in the hospital. I figured this would allow them to continue their vacation while keeping me company, but he rejected the notion almost immediately. He ignored my concerns, calling me foolish for making such a huge deal about small injuries. He dismissed my notion of calling my father, arguing that it would just make him worry more. He felt there was no need to interrupt anybody else's plans over something as minor as a concussion and a fractured arm, which he believed would mend well with a few days of hospital rest. In the end, his pressure was effective. I stared at my mother, hoping she would hold her ground and insist on staying with me, but as usual, she caved to him. Instead of battling for what I needed, she decided to go. She only stayed with me for one night, which provided some consolation. I clung to the hope that after seeing how vulnerable I was, she would realize I needed her presence. But the next day, he arrived at the hospital to bring her, anxious to embark on the vacation as planned, without regard for how I was doing. I felt abandoned and deceived when my mother left me alone in the hospital after only one day alone. I couldn't stop crying. One of the nurses, Jessica, saw me crying. When she realized I didn't have anyone nearby to check on me, she offered to phone my mother. I told her it was all right, that they would probably not respond, but she insisted, so I gave her my father's number instead. I partly expected my father to chastise me or, like him, tell me that I was exaggerating and that being alone in the hospital was no big issue. But when my father answered the phone and the nurse, Jessica, told him about my position, he was immediately alarmed. He sounded more concerned than I had heard Dad in a long time, and inquired whether my mother had truly gone on the vacation without me. I described everything, including how he insisted on leaving me behind because he didn't want the trip money to go to waste, and how my mother eventually consented. My father was outraged. As I told him everything, he became silent, but I could sense his rage simmering. He then told me that my mother had just indicated that we had been in a little fender bender, downplaying the entire incident. She hadn't mentioned my fractured arm, concussion, or the fact that she and he had left me alone in the hospital. According to what she told him, there was nothing to worry about. Therefore, he didn't feel the need to contact me. Hearing that my mother had willfully lied about my circumstances to my father made me feel even more hurt and betrayed. My father instantly told me that he will come over as soon as possible. He said he'd drop everything, drive to the hospital, and remain with me for as long as it took. For the first time since my admission, I felt relieved, knowing that my father was on his way to be with me, and that someone was finally taking my condition seriously. As I sat there waiting, I realized how much I needed this type of support in my life. Within 2 hours, my father arrived at the hospital. Seeing him enter through the door felt like a great weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I started crying as he hugged me and promised me that everything will be fine. He then went straight to my doctor, Dr. Emily Carter, making sure he grasped every aspect of my injuries. I could see relief on his face as he affirmed that while my injuries were severe and significant, they were not life-threatening. He genuinely regretted not being there for me sooner and not challenging my mother's version of events. He told me he regretted assuming that everything was good without personally checking in on me, and it was evident he was beating himself up over it. My father was visibly angry at him. He was upset that my stepfather had the audacity to dismiss my demands and then choose to go on a trip rather than ensure my well-being. His lack of respect and concern by leaving me alone in the hospital demonstrated how little I meant to him. His behavior screamed volumes, indicating that despite being married to my mother, I was nothing more than an annoyance to him. My father tried contacting my mother and him, but neither answered. This infuriated Dad even more, and he vowed that he would give him and Mom a lesson for abandoning me like this. Over the next 2 nights, my father stayed by my side, having taken time from work to ensure that I was not alone. He never left me alone till I was released. Even then, he wasn't keen about me returning to his place, where I'd be left with only a babysitter until everyone returned. Instead, he insisted I accompany him home, and I consented. Once I arrived at my father's house, he attempted to contact Mom again. She claimed to have missed his previous call since she was having so much fun with him and his sons, Tyler and Hunter. Hearing this inflamed his rage even more, and he did not hold back. He forcefully told her that her actions were unacceptable, that abandoning me in the hospital was a major act of neglect, and that he intended to take legal action to hold her and him responsible. He even mentioned taking her to court if necessary, which implies she could lose custody of me. He made it apparent that he was ready to report her and him for their activities. Since then, my phone has been constantly vibrating with calls and texts from him and my mother. Instead of accepting their actions or apologizing, they've been sending messages accusing me of ruining their vacation by informing my father about my position. He has even gone so far as to claim that all I had to do was keep my mouth shut and silently remain in the hospital without causing a scene. They said everything would have been okay if I had just complied. I was made to feel bad about throwing my mom and stepdad under the bus. Update 1 for everyone who is asking. Now that I've had some time to think about it and spoken with my father, I know how many times he and Mom have neglected me over the years, and I've just let it happen. I remained silent, thinking things would change, but they never did. It's difficult to accept, yet I let myself be pushed aside for their convenience. Now, thinking back, I can't believe I put up with it for so long. For example, He frequently strained my relationship with my father. He would continually make disparaging comments about him, calling him a deadbeat or a loser in comparison to him. He believed my father was not a good spouse to my mother, and as a result, he felt he had the right to criticize him whenever he wanted. Mom never asked him to stop. When I experienced problems at home or tried to talk to my mother about them, he always rejected my concerns. He would tell me that I was exaggerating things or that I was overly sensitive because I was a girl. He often said that this was why he was so fortunate to have only boys. He consistently demonstrated preference for his sons, Tyler and Hunter, even in minor everyday exchanges. He was always willing to help them with their bills. But if I asked my mother for anything, he would probe me with endless questions. He often accused me of buying useless items and wasting money. Even though it wasn't his money, it was my father's money. Therefore, I should have had the freedom to spend it any way I chose. Despite living in the same house, we never had quality time together as a family. He and Mom would frequently make plans with his sons, Tyler and Hunter, and exclude me, claiming they didn't want to bother me or wanted to spend quality time together without me. This often made me feel abandoned and unimportant. They'd go out to dinner or do activities they enjoyed without thinking about whether I'd want to join. This is perhaps why I was so delighted to accompany them on their vacation. They rarely engage me in their plans. He and Mom also do not like to celebrate my birthdays. They usually tell me that since his sons, Tyler and Hunter, don't make a big fuss about their birthdays, I shouldn't expect much either. It's as if they assume I don't deserve particular attention simply because it's not their style. When it comes to gifts, I constantly wind up with stuff I don't like or utilize, as if they didn't think about what I genuinely appreciate. Whenever I was failing in school, he would say stuff like, "You're just lazy, that's your problem, and why do you even bother with that stuff?" Instead of asking what was wrong or providing assistance, he complained about how it inconvenienced him. Mom, on the other hand, would remain mute, offering no words of comfort or support, despite knowing how badly it affected me. Update 2. So, my father did report Mom and him to CPS. It wasn't an easy decision for him, but he felt it was necessary to make sure what had happened wasn't overlooked. He couldn't just sit back and allow them to treat me that way, abandoning me in the hospital without a second thought. When he and my mother came home, they were contacted by CPS. They had to answer numerous questions about their actions, their behavior, and their decision to leave me behind. I'm sure it was a wake-up call for them, something they probably didn't expect. But the authorities sided with my father. Leaving me behind in the hospital, especially after I'd been injured, was unacceptable. They acknowledged that I had been neglected in a way that put my well-being at risk. Later, my mother called me. She wasn't happy. Her tone made it clear she was furious with me. She told me that by involving CPS, I had caused a lot of trouble for both her and him. She seemed to blame me for everything that had happened, even though I knew I had done nothing wrong. She warned me that CPS would be contacting me soon to hear my side of the story. Then, she pressured me to lie to the authorities, threatening that if I didn't, I would be taken away from her and she would lose custody. I told her I couldn't lie to the authorities. I reminded her that she should have thought about the consequences of abandoning me in the hospital before making that choice. Mom tried to guilt-trip me, saying she had given me years of her life and that I needed to prove my loyalty to her now. She made it sound like I was betraying her by being honest with the authorities, as if I was the one to blame for everything that happened. What shocked me most was when she said that lying would protect him and his sons, Tyler and Hunter. She emphasized that CPS investigating him could cause trouble with his ex-wife and warned that she might use this situation against him. I just shook my head, realizing that my mom cared more about his reputation and her own than about what I had gone through. She never once asked about my health or recovery. She begged me to lie and protect her family instead. I couldn't take her selfishness anymore. I stood my ground and told her clearly that I didn't care how this affected her or him. I wouldn't lie to the authorities. I told her I would tell them the truth about everything that happened, and I wouldn't cover up for anyone. If that meant she and he were in trouble, so be it. They were the adults. They made the mistakes, not me. I refused to shield them from the consequences. My mother raged at me, calling me names, but I wouldn't back down. Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since I last updated. I spoke to the authorities and told them the truth. For now, I'm staying with my father. He's been looking into schools, and he's trying to make arrangements for me to live with him permanently. I have to admit, Living with him feels good. My mom has clearly abandoned her obligation to me, and that can't be overlooked. CPS has urged her to make significant changes, including taking parenting classes and counseling to address her neglect and her strained relationship with me. He was also questioned, as he had shown a lack of respect and concern for me, especially after what happened at the hospital. CPS has made it clear they will continue monitoring the situation. If and when I return to stay with them, they warned that any further negligence or cruelty would lead to more severe consequences. 4 months later. I can't believe it's been almost 4 months since I started living with Dad. It feels like I'm finally in a place where I don't have to walk on eggshells or question my worth. Living with him has been a huge relief. He's supportive, listens to me, and, most importantly, respects my space and my decisions. It's been a complete 180 from what I was dealing with before. I feel heard here. I can talk to him about my day, my troubles, and my dreams, and he actually cares. I've been able to focus more on my studies and my mental health, and I feel like I'm starting to get back to my true self. I've also made some wonderful new friends at school, and I really enjoy spending time with them. In fact, last month, for the first time in years, I was able to properly celebrate my birthday. I invited all my friends over, we had pizza, and we watched cheesy romantic movies. It was the kind of birthday I'd always wanted, but never had while living with my mom and him. Mom's situation is still complicated. She's been trying to contact me more often recently, texting me to apologize and tell me how much she misses me. Part of me feels guilty for staying away, but then I remember everything that led me here. I've made it clear that I'm still not ready to return. While she continues to reach out, I've set boundaries for myself. Her actions were harmful, and she needs to take full responsibility for them. As for him, he's never apologized or taken responsibility for his behavior. Honestly, I'm not surprised. He's never shown any real concern for me or my well-being. I'll never forget how he treated me, especially in the hospital. I don't care if he ever changes. I'm not waiting to find out. I've learned to rely on myself and on the people who truly care about me.